The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song at 0347, a sound Elena Martinez had stopped hearing 3 years ago. Sacred Heart's night shift moved like a living organism around her, monitors beeping in staccato rhythm, rubber soles squeaking on polished tile, the distant wheeze of a ventilator in ICU. She moved through the corridors with the kind of steady precision that made younger nurses look clumsy by comparison, though none of them would ever notice. None of them knew. That was the point. Her shift report sat cold in her hands as she pushed the med cart toward room 347, the new admission from the highway pileup on IR5. John Doe. Unconscious. No wallet. No identification. Just a name the paramedics hadn't given him yet because the paramedics didn't have one. Elena had seen her share of trauma cases, 20 years worth, though these days she measured it in bedpans and vitals instead of missions and extraction points. The limp in her left leg, the one her 17-year-old son Marcus thought came from a car accident when he was 6, had long ago stopped being a physical tell. Now it was just part of her. Part of the invisible woman who worked nights and asked no questions. The hospital corridor stretched ahead like a runway, fluorescent panels casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made human skin look like it belonged to the recently deceased. Elena's scrubs were the color of old denim, faded from too many washings. Her badge hung from a lanyard that had seen better decades. The name on the badge read simply Elena Martinez, RN, in typeface so small it required actual effort to read. That was also the point. She'd left her locker 15 minutes ago, the same locker where a pair of worn combat boots sat in a canvas bag at the very bottom, beneath her street clothes and a dying succulent in a ceramic pot. The boots hadn't been worn in 20 years. She had no intention of wearing them now. Some things belonged to the past. Some things belonged to someone else entirely. The emergency bay doors had crashed open 27 minutes ago. She'd noted the time automatically, the way her brain had been trained to note times, the way neural pathways never really forgot their original purpose no matter how hard you tried to reprogram them. Ambulance 47 screaming in from the northbound IR5 collector lanes, multi-vehicle collision, 1 patient critical condition. The paramedics shouted vitals as they wheeled him through triage of male, approximately 40 years old, GCS of 4, unresponsive to pain, significant head trauma with loss of consciousness. Admitted to room 347. Trauma bay extension. Full workup pending. Elena had been in the supply room when the admission alert went out. She was always in the supply room during the initial chaos. It was easier that way. Easier to avoid the crush of residents and attending physicians who made decisions based on what they saw, which was never anything accurate. Easier to move through rooms afterward, when the decisions had been made and the chart had been written and no one had time to notice that the quiet night nurse who refilled 4 bags and emptied bedpans was probably the only person in the hospital who could perform an emergency cricothyrotomy in the dark. The doors to room 347 slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and Elena's hands were steady as she approached the bed. They were always steady. That was the training talking. That was muscle memory encoded in her forearms and fingers over 18 years of active service, the kind of steady that came from holding trauma shears while shells fell like rain on the streets of Tikrit, from keeping central lines patent under fire, from knowing that if your hands shook, someone's mother didn't come home. Elena's hands did not shake. The patient lay motionless beneath a white hospital blanket, his left shoulder exposed for the admission assessment. The doctors had already been through. Dr. Hargrove had made his entrance, all cologne and condescension, ordering the standard imaging protocol before sweeping back out to wherever he'd come from. Elena had learned his patterns. Everyone learned Dr. Hargrove's patterns. Enter. Command. Exit. Never stay long enough to actually listen. She was here to check vitals. Standard post-admission protocol. She'd done this procedure 4,000 times, maybe more. She could do it in her sleep. She could do it while having an existential crisis. She could do it while the world stopped making sense. Elena's eyes moved to the patient's left shoulder first, almost without her permission, drawn like compass points to true north. There was the tattoo. A ranger tab. Black ink, Professional work, maybe 15 years old based on the settling of the pigment beneath the epidermis. Not fresh. Not recent. Just permanent. The kind of permanent that meant something. The kind of permanent that meant this man had stood in front of a mirror at Fort Benning and made a choice about who he was going to be. She recognized the tattoo. She recognized them all. She could draw every Ranger tab that had come through this hospital, could identify the unit by the depth of the shading, by the angle of the lettering. But that wasn't why her breath stopped in her chest. That wasn't why the air in the room suddenly felt like it was being pulled through a screen. It was his face. Elena's hands continued their work, BP cuff sliding onto his right arm, fingers finding the radial pulse, her eyes reading the wall-mounted monitor with practiced efficiency. The monitor showed a rhythm that matched what her fingertips found, a pulse of 78 beats per minute, steady but shallow. Respiration 12 and even. O2 sat on the supplemental oxygen at 94%. Stable. For now. But her mind was 17 years in the past. Correction. 20 years in the past. Further. To Tikrit in 2004, to the streets of Jolan district where a routine convoy was about to become something else entirely, where she'd been Staff Sergeant Elena Martinez then, before the PTSD had carved her into pieces, before she'd chosen the relative safety of San Diego and night shifts and invisibility. The boy had been 7 years old. That was the part that didn't make sense, except it did. 7 years old, his face covered in dust and blood, his small fingers clawing at the window of the burning Humvee while mortars walked closer with each explosion. She dragged him out herself, her hands under his armpits, pulling him from the flames while Specialist Jackson returned fire and her team worked to extract the wounded from the first vehicle. The boy's name was, she couldn't remember the name. She'd worked very hard not to remember names. But his face was a thing that had lived behind her eyelids for 20 years, a ghost that woke her at 3 in the morning, a weight that never quite left her chest. He'd been 7. That had made him approximately 27 now, which was roughly accurate to the age of the unconscious man on the hospital bed in front of her. The math worked. The math was very, very clear. Elena's jaw clenched once, a nearly imperceptible tightening of the muscles at the angle of her mandible. The kind of response that someone trained in observing body language would recognize immediately as a moment of significant emotional dysregulation. The kind of response that a trained military observer would understand meant something had just shattered. She set the blood pressure reading down on the chart, 118/72, elevated but not concerning, and moved her hands to the patient's abdomen, her fingers palpating gently for distension, for rigidity, for any sign of internal bleeding. Her touch was exactly what it had been in the triage bay of a field hospital in Anbar province, light enough not to cause additional trauma, experienced enough to feel things beneath the skin that newer nurses would miss entirely. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Not her voice. She'd stopped using her voice out loud for most things. This voice belonged to someone else, someone standing in a hospital corridor in San Diego in 2024, someone who was exactly no one. Staff Sergeant. Not voices she used. She performed her work in silence whenever possible, the way ghosts performed any work at all. But this man, this boy, this impossible echo of someone who wasn't supposed to exist in her present tense, had belonged to a unit that called her Senior Chief. Had belonged to a world where she'd been someone. Where she'd held things together. The door to room 347 pushed inward with enough force to suggest irritation, and Dr. Hargrove entered like a man who'd never been taught to knock. He was tall, the kind of tall that made him lean forward slightly to fit through doorways, though he'd learned to lean in a way that suggested he was choosing to condescend rather than being forced to accommodate the architecture. His white coat was pristine, his stethoscope dangled across his shoulders like a certificate of superiority, and his eyes moved across Elena with the kind of disinterest usually reserved for furniture. The quiet one. His observation came out like an assessment, the way a man might comment on the quality of institutional coffee. Still playing with the chart. Elena's hands continued their work. The patient's abdomen was soft, non-distended, no obvious signs of trauma beyond what the imaging would catch. She made a small notation on the admission sheet, her handwriting as precise as someone taking testimony in a courtroom. 3 years of night shifts at Sacred Heart, and Dr. Hargrove still had not learned her name beyond the generic descriptor he'd assigned her on day 1. "Vital stable," Elena said. Her voice came out measured, careful, pitched at the exact decibel level that made it easy for someone like Dr. Hargrove to dismiss. BP 118/72, heart rate 78, respiration 12. Pupils equal and reactive at 3 mm. Abdomen soft on palpation. She did not mention the tattoo. She did not mention the face. She did not mention that the past had just walked into her present with a split forehead and a GCS score of 4. "Of course they're stable," Dr. Hargrove said, moving toward the bedside with the gait of a man accustomed to having his path cleared by the simple force of his presence. "He's been here less than 30 minutes. Send him for CT head and cervical spine imaging. Full trauma protocol. And someone should update his chart to reflect that we've ruled out spinal fracture before he wakes up." He paused, his eyes moving to Elena with something like amusement. "Unless you think a nurse who changes bedpans has the training to rule out spinal fracture." Elena's jaw did not clench a second time. Her face did not flush. Her hands did not tremble. The trembling was somewhere else entirely, somewhere beneath the skin, somewhere in the electrical pathways of her nervous system that remembered what it was like to hold a 7-year-old while the world burned around them. Somewhere that she'd gotten very good at hiding. "I'll make the imaging request now," Elena said, and her voice was exactly as it had been, steady, compliant, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that the quietest person in any room was often the only one still thinking clearly. She moved toward the door, her eyes sliding past Dr. Hargrove's with the practiced invisibility that had become her greatest skill. Behind her, on the hospital bed, the boy she'd pulled from fire 20 years ago lay unconscious, his face unmarked except for the split along his left temple, his breathing shallow and even, his ranger tattoo visible on a shoulder that had learned to carry the weight of surviving things that shouldn't have survived. The room went quiet. Just the sound of the heart monitor, steady and neutral, and the distant wheeze of a ventilator down the hall, and the hiss of Elena's breath held so carefully in her chest that no one would have noticed she was breathing at all. But that wasn't the worst part. The room held its breath. Elena's phone was already in her hand, not for a photo, but for identification. The sister, Marcus's older sister Jennifer, stood at the foot of the bed with her teenage son. 17 years old. Same age Marcus had been when that Humvee caught fire in Tikrit. Elena's hands moved with practiced steadiness, angling the light toward the ranger tattoo on his left shoulder. The curved tab, the scrollwork, the insignia unmistakable to anyone who'd ever worn the uniform. She photographed it, clinical documentation, protocol compliant, the kind of thing you do when a patient has no ID and family is present. Jennifer leaned closer. Is that his unit?" Elena's voice stayed level. "Likely helps identify him once he wakes. We'll cross-reference with military records." She lowered the phone. The monitor beeped steady. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that hospital pallor, the kind of light that made everyone look like ghosts. That was when Dr. Hargrove walked in. He didn't knock. He never did. The door swung open hard enough that Jennifer flinched, and Hargrove's presence filled the room the way diesel exhaust fills an enclosed space, thick, inescapable, hostile. His scrubs were wrinkled. His tie was crooked. His eyes landed on Elena with the intensity of a man looking at something he'd decided was beneath him about 3 seconds before. "Martinez. What the hell are you doing?" Elena's hands didn't move. The phone stayed at her side. She'd learned long ago that defensive movements telegraphed fear, and fear was something Dr. Hargrove could smell like blood in water. "Assisting with patient identification, doctor. Playing detective instead of following protocol, you mean?" He stepped toward the bed, his voice loud enough to echo off the tile. "Nurses follow orders. They don't investigate. They don't conduct interviews. They don't play amateur investigator with their phones." He turned to Jennifer, and his smile appeared, the kind of smile that had probably charmed hospital boards and donors and people who didn't know what cruelty looked like in a white coat. "I'm so sorry about this. Bedpan Betty here means well, but she's not really equipped for critical thinking. The words landed like shrapnel. Jennifer's face went pale. Her son shifted, uncomfortable, the way teenagers do when they're witnessing something wrong and don't have the authority to stop it. Elena took one measured breath through her nose. When she spoke, her voice hadn't changed pitch or volume. It was still level, still professional, still the voice of someone following orders. I was attempting to identify him, Doctor. Military records cross-reference would expedite notification of next of kin. You were wasting time that could cost someone their life. This hospital doesn't need nurses playing detective. We need nurses following chain of command. Hargrove turned away from her, toward Jennifer. I apologize again. If you have questions about your brother's care, you direct them to me. Not to, well. He gestured vaguely at Elena, the gesture itself a dismissal. Write it up, Martinez. You know the protocol. He left. Just walked out, his shoes clicking on the tile in that particular rhythm that came from someone who'd never spent a day worrying whether his footsteps would echo. Elena's left eye watered. Just that one eye, just one tear, just enough that she felt it run warm down her cheek. She didn't blink. She didn't break eye contact with the doorway where Hargrove had just exited. She reached up, wiped the tear with the back of her gloved hand without looking away, without giving anyone in the room the satisfaction of thinking she'd been broken by what they'd witnessed. Jennifer was staring at her with something like horror. Elena's voice was quiet when she spoke, quiet enough that only the three of them heard it. Some of us remember what it means to leave no one behind. The words hung in the room like smoke. Jennifer didn't ask what they meant. Maybe she understood. Maybe she didn't. Either way, Elena turned back to the monitors, to the lines of data scrolling across screens, to the work of keeping a man alive who didn't know he'd already been saved twice. 40 minutes later, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the nursing station. Elena saw it when she returned from vitals check on room 349. Her name was printed in that clinical sans serif font, the kind that made accusations look official and permanent. Nurse Martinez, inappropriate focus on non-medical details. Insubordination. Failure to follow chain of command. Mandatory review. The signature line held Dr. Hargrove's initials, scratched in blue ink, every letter like a knife. She read it once. Only once. The kind of reading where you memorize something without trying, where the words become part of your cellular memory whether you want them or not. The break room smelled like old coffee and the particular despair of fluorescent lighting. Elena pushed through the door at 1,447 hours. 3 nurses were there, Rebecca from the day's shift, Kim from pediatrics, Paolo who'd worked alongside her for 2 years without knowing anything except that she was quiet and competent. They looked up when she entered. They saw her. And then, in unison like they'd choreographed it, they stood. Chairs scraped across linoleum. No one spoke. Rebecca wouldn't meet her eyes. Kim's jaw was tight. Paolo's hands clenched, the physical manifestation of something he wanted to say but couldn't afford to. They walked out without a word. The door closed behind them. Elena stood alone in a room that suddenly felt cavernous. The fluorescent lights hummed that particular frequency that existed just below consciousness, the sound that drove people insane if they listened to it long enough. She sat down at the worn table where night shift nurses had eaten lunch for 15 years. Her cold coffee sat in front of her, abandoned an hour ago when the John Doe had been admitted, untouched since. She picked it up. Drank it. Tasted nothing. On the table beside her cup was a photograph. She hadn't meant to bring it here. It must have fallen from her locker or her pocket or one of those small spaces where people kept their evidence of who they actually were. The photo was water-damaged at the edges, the colors faded to something like sepia even though it was taken in 2005. 8 military personnel in desert camouflage, standing in front of a tent in Tikrit with a kind of pride that comes from surviving something most people can't imagine. There was Elena, Senior Chief Petty Officer Martinez, 28 years old, her arm around the shoulder of a boy who was barely old enough to drink, the same boy who was sleeping in room 347 with no memory of her face. 4 of the 8 were dead. KIA or complications from injuries that never quite healed. Their names were carved into her muscle memory the way muscle memory carved themselves into soldiers. She could taste their names like copper. She looked down at the photo, at her own face from a lifetime ago, at a version of Elena Martinez that had loved medicine and war and the men she'd saved in equal measure. The version of Elena who had something to believe in besides survival. The door opened again. Hargrove passed by the break room window. He paused when he saw her, slowed his pace, made deliberate eye contact. Then he smiled. The smile of a man who'd just won something. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence said everything, that he'd seen her isolated, that he'd seen her humiliated, that he'd seen her pushed to the margins of her own workplace by the sheer force of his institutional authority. He walked on. Elena sat with the cold coffee and the water-damaged photograph and the smell of antiseptic and the humming of lights that never turned off. She thought about Tikrit. She thought about that 7-year-old reaching for her hands, about the feel of him in her arms, about the moment she'd known he would live. She thought about 20 years of silence, of building a life where no one could hurt her again because no one knew who she was. She thought about the man in room 347, the ranger with the tattoo, the soldier who'd carried her rescue inside his cells for 2 decades without ever knowing her name. And then, somewhere in the hospital beyond the break room walls, an alarm began to scream. The alarm screamed at 0200. Not the soft beeping of a routine alert. The violent, unforgiving wail that meant a human body was collapsing. Elena heard it from the medication station and moved before her brain registered which room. Room 347. She was already running. The ranger's monitors painted a story in red. Heart rate climbing, 142, then 156, then pushing into the 170s. Blood pressure dropping like a stone down a well, 90/60, then 85, then 72. His jugular veins distended, stretched taut against his neck like rope pulled to breaking point. His oxygen saturation sinking despite the high-flow mask already in place. 68, 64, 61. The room smelled of sweat and antiseptic and something else, the copper tang of blood pooling where it had no business being. Elena's hands moved through the scene like they were reading a map written in vital signs and muffled heart sounds. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing the heart from the outside, squeezing it like a fist around a beating organ, preventing it from filling properly, choking the body's blood supply into starvation. She'd seen this before. In Tikrit. In a field hospital where a sergeant's chest wound had filled with blood that couldn't escape, and the only thing standing between him and death was a needle and 30 seconds of knowing exactly where to push. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen in the doorway, his phone already in his hand, his face the color of old medical charts. "Call back up," Elena said. Not a request. An order. The voice that came out wasn't the soft, deferential voice of the night shift nurse who apologized for existing. This was a different frequency entirely. Now. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. He stared at his phone as though it were a foreign object he'd never encountered. Elena was already moving. She pushed past the forestand, past the monitor stand, into the space where seconds were currency and indecision was a death sentence. The heart sounds were muffled, she could barely hear them through her stethoscope, as if the organ was calling from inside a thick fog. That was the fluid. That was the killer. She needed a needle. She needed it now. The equipment drawer slid open on silent runners. 18-gauge needle. Syringe. She'd done this with combat boots on in a tent lit by chemical lanterns while mortars fell outside. The mechanics of the body didn't change. The location didn't matter. Fluid was fluid. Pressure was pressure. Death waited the same way everywhere. "I need the ultrasound machine," she said to whoever was at the monitor. Not a question. They moved. The ultrasound probe found the pericardial sac in 1.2 seconds. She could see it even before the image rendered, could feel the location in her hands like muscle memory surfacing from 20 years of burial. There. The fifth intercostal space. The midclavicular line. She'd memorized this geography when the geometry was that a young ranger had been burning in the dark and she was the only person in the vehicle who understood the math of survival. Hargrove was still holding his phone. Dr. Hargrove. Call. Now. Her voice had dropped half an octave. The kind of authority that doesn't ask permission. He dialed. His hands trembled. Elena cleaned the skin with chlorhexidine, the smell sharp and acrid, cutting through the blood smell. She felt the needle in her fingertips, felt the angle like a pilot feels the moment before a plane leaves the ground. This was the moment where everything folded into a single point. One movement. One chance. The needle went in Anne. The hiss. The beautiful, terrible hiss of air and pressure escaping. Dark fluid drew up into the syringe. 30 milliliters. 40. 50. With each ml the pressure released, the heart could expand again, could fill, could pump. The heart rate was dropping already. 156 down to 142. 142 down to 128. The blood pressure was climbing. 72 becoming 82, becoming 92, becoming 104. 02 sat rising. 64 up to 72. 72 to 81. 81 to 89. Sinus rhythm. The kind of rhythm that meant life instead of the alternative. The ranger's sister was crying in the corner, her hands over her mouth, her eyes moving from her brother to Elena and back again. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Elena didn't respond. She was already documenting. Time. Amount. Character of fluid. The clinical notation of a procedure that had just made the difference between a funeral and a homecoming. Hargrove stood in the doorway, his phone at his ear, his expression the color of ash. By 0600, the sun was starting its climb over San Diego and the Ranger was stable. Genuinely stable. Not the fragile kind where one small change could cascade into disaster. His sister was holding his hand, whispering thank you into the curve of his shoulder every 10 minutes like a prayer that might break if she stopped speaking it. Elena had checked his chest X-ray 3 times. The pericardial fluid was resolving. No new accumulation. The cardiac silhouette was normal size again, the heart no longer drowning. She was writing her shift notes when Hargrove walked in with another man. The man wore a suit that cost more than Elena's monthly rent. His briefcase was leather that had probably cost as much as the suit. His name was Paxton, and he moved like a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. He was carrying a file, Elena's file, she realized, and his eyes moved over the notes from the night like he was reading a death certificate. "Show me the pericardiocentesis documentation," Paxton said. Elena didn't move. "It's in the chart." "The unauthorized procedure?" "The one performed by a registered nurse without physician oversight." His voice was the tone of someone reading a script he'd already written the ending to. "Show me the documentation of the actual procedure." Elena turned to her computer, pulled up her notes. Showed him the time stamp. 0203 hours. The patient response. The vitals. Everything that proved it had happened and worked. 43 milliliters of sanguineous fluid. One human life. No second chances left. Paxton read it like someone checking a receipt. His eyes never widened. His expression never changed. "Are you aware," he said to Elena, but not really to Elena, he was speaking to the written record now, to the precedent he was establishing, that emergency pericardiocentesis exceeds the scope of practice for a registered nurse in the state of California. "Yes," Elena said. "And you performed it anyway?" "Yes." Dr. Hargrove has documented that he was unaware this procedure was being performed. That he did not authorize it. That he was, in fact, called for backup after the procedure had already been initiated. Paxton turned a page of his briefcase documents. This is a serious violation of the chain of command and institutional protocol. The room was very quiet. Elena could hear the ventilator in the next room's steady hiss. Could hear the monitors beeping their digital heartbeats. Could hear the rain that had started somewhere around 0530, drumming against the window like impatient fingers. She didn't say anything. Paxton closed his briefcase. "We have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. Mr. Wallace from security will escort you through the exit process. You understand?" It wasn't a question. At 0745, Elena walked out of Sacred Heart with a cardboard box that used to hold printer paper. Inside it, the cracked mug her son had made her in 3rd grade that said "World's Best Mom" in letters that had cracked and faded. The dying succulent she'd been trying to keep alive for 2 years, its leaves papery and brown. The photograph of her medical team from Tikrit, 8 people, 4 of them now underground, all of them gone from the version of her life she was supposed to be living. And underneath, wrapped in plastic at the bottom, her combat boots. The one she'd worn in the field. The one she'd convinced herself to bury in the back of the closet at home, unworn for 20 years, a relic of a person she was no longer supposed to be. Hargrove watched from the administrative window, his arms crossed, his face the satisfied expression of a man who had successfully removed a threat. What he didn't know, what nobody in the hospital knew, was that the Rangers' medical records were being processed through the Department of Defense database at that exact moment. Routine updating. Notation of the life-saving intervention. Name of the registered nurse. Professional credentials. Unit notation, former Navy Medical Corps. Pentagon routing automatic. The notation would reach the right desk by 10:45 hours. By 11:45, Elena was at a bus stop on Harbor Drive, rain hammering down so hard that cars spray-painted water past her legs as they passed. She was still wearing her scrubs. She hadn't thought to change. The box sat on the ground beside her, and she stared at it like it contained proof of something she wasn't supposed to know about herself anymore. A bus pulled up. Then pulled away. She didn't get on. The rain was cold. The cardboard box was getting soft at the corners, water beginning to soak through. Inside, that photograph would start to curl and fade. Inside, her mother's mug would crack further. Inside, the combat boots would remember what they'd been trained to do. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. By 0400 hours, Dr. Hargrove was on the phone with the hospital board chair, his voice sharp as a scalpel. Unauthorized procedure. Unqualified staff. He paced his office, the Venetian blinds cutting shadows across his desk like prison bars. She performed a pericardiocentesis without physician authorization. Regardless of outcome, protocol was violated. The board chair listened. Hargrove knew how to sound reasonable when his career was burning. He'd spent 20 years cultivating relationships with people who answered phones at 4 a.m., and he was calling in every favor he'd ever earned. By 0430, he had 3 board members who would take his calls. By 0500, he was dialing St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Phoenix, where Elena had worked 7 years prior, his fingers moving with the precision of a man erasing his mistake. "I'm requesting personnel records on a former RN," Hargrove told the HR director, his tone bureaucratic, official. Elena Martinez. Employment dates 2014 to 2017. I need reference verification and any incident reports filed during her tenure. The Phoenix hospital pulled her file. There was nothing. 5 years of spotless performance reviews, commendations for patient care, 0 complaints. The HR director read the file over the phone. Hargrove's jaw tightened with each clean entry. Any disciplinary actions? Anything at all? No. Nothing. He hung up and made 3 more calls to hospitals in California where Elena had worked before San Diego, before Sacred Heart, before she became a ghost with a stethoscope. The pattern was identical. Perfect records. No conflicts. No red flags. No ammunition. He sat in the darkness of his office at 0547, the city beginning to wake outside his window, and realized that his one viable strategy was to reframe salvation as recklessness. He called in investigator Paxton at 0600. "I need a formal review of the emergency procedure performed in room 347 last night," Hargrove said, already rehearsing the narrative. "An unauthorized intervention performed by nursing staff without physician oversight. I want documentation that the procedure was medically inappropriate, that it fell outside scope of practice, and that it exposed the hospital to liability." Paxton was a former nurse, now a hospital compliance officer, hired specifically to insulate administration from lawsuits. He arrived at Sacred Heart by 07:15 with a leather folder and the dull gaze of a man who'd seen too many hospitals protect the wrong people. Hargrove walked him through the events: the ranger's deterioration, Elena's sudden medical expertise, the needle decompression performed without orders. "She saved his life," Paxton said, reviewing the post-procedure vitals. "Oxygen saturation 96%. Sinus rhythm stable. She may have saved his life. But did she have authorization?" Paxton wrote that down. "That's the question we need answered." Elena was in the staff break room when security arrived at 0745. She knew before they opened the door. There was a particular kind of silence that followed termination, a held breath that meant policy had won. The guard held a manila envelope. "Your final paycheck and separation documentation, Ms. Martinez." She didn't reach for it immediately. Her eye stayed on the coffee in front of her, cold now, skin forming across the surface like a message written in oils. The second guard, younger, with the soft eyes of someone still new to the job, wouldn't meet her gaze. Paxton stood in the doorway with Dr. Hargrove beside him, the two men positioned like witnesses to an execution. "The hospital has determined that the procedure performed without physician authorization constitutes a serious breach of protocol," Paxton read from the letter, his voice steady and empty of feeling. "Effective immediately, your employment at Sacred Heart Hospital is terminated. You are required to surrender your badge and ID immediately and are banned from the premises." Elena stood. Her movements were deliberate, economical, the same precision she'd used 1,000 times to move between patients in the dark. She unclipped her hospital badge from her scrub pocket and placed it in the young guard's palm. Her hands didn't shake. That would have been mercy, and Hargrove didn't deserve to see mercy. She'd been trained in a place where mercy was a liability and composure was armor, and she wore that armor now the way other women wore tears. She picked up the manila envelope and held it against her thigh, a cardboard rectangle containing the administrative death of the person she'd spent 3 years becoming. "You can go home now," Hargrove said behind her, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd just survived something difficult. "You can go home." But Elena understood what he meant. He meant, you can disappear. You can stop hiding the person you were and admit that you never stopped being her. The message was clear because it was meant to be, you don't belong here, you never belonged here, and the fact that you saved a life doesn't change the fact that you broke the rules doing it. The locker room was empty. She'd never accumulated much, a few scrub jackets, a pen that leaked, a photo of her unit from 2004 that she'd kept taped to the inside of her locker door. She took the photo down and held it for a moment, 8 faces in desert fatigues, half of them dead now, all of them wearing the particular exhaustion of people who'd learned what their bodies could survive. She placed it in her cardboard box, the one the hospital had given her to carry her belongings. The box was smaller than she expected, almost insultingly so. A pair of worn combat boots from 2003 had been hidden in the bottom of her locker since day one, laces knotted tight, the leather creased at the ankles where they'd bent and bent again. She'd kept them because you don't throw away combat boots, not when they'd walked through 3 tours and across 1,000 nightmares. She placed them in the box, on top of the photo. A cracked coffee mug that read "World's Best Mom" in faded letters, a gift from Marcus when he was 7, before he understood that heroes weren't supposed to have children, weren't supposed to have normal lives, weren't supposed to work night shifts at hospitals where everyone thought they were just ordinary people doing ordinary work. A dying succulent, brittle and brown, that someone had left on her locker for no particular reason 3 months ago. She'd kept watering it out of habit, the way she kept showing up for shift after shift, the way she kept pretending that invisibility was a choice. She walked out of Sacred Heart at 0847 on a Thursday morning in San Diego, carrying a cardboard box that contained everything the past 3 years had allowed her to gather. The rain was soft, intermittent, not storm rain but the kind that felt like tears someone else was crying. She caught the bus at the corner of 3rd and Mission, standing at the shelter with her box held against her chest like something that might break if she let go. 40 minutes passed. The bus came and went. She let it pass. A woman with a stroller asked if she needed help. Elena said no. A man in a business suit offered her his umbrella. Elena said no. She stood at the bus stop while the rain fell, and somewhere in the calculation of that moment, she understood that the 3 years of careful hiding had amounted to exactly this, a wet cardboard box and the recognition that you can't run from what you are. The photo of her unit team was getting damp. The succulent soil was turning to mud. Her combat boots were absorbing water like they'd absorbed desert sand once, like they remembered every terrain and could learn new ones. The rain wasn't heavy, but it was thorough, and Elena stood in it without moving because moving meant accepting that she had nowhere to go. That's when Marcus found her. Her 17-year-old son came around the corner at a run, his backpack already soaked, his breathing jagged with the kind of panic that only a child can feel when they realize their parent is broken. Mom. He was trying not to cry, which meant he was crying. I went to the attic. I found these. He held a wooden case, dark lacquered wood with brass hinges, the kind of box that held things you didn't look at very often because looking meant remembering. Marcus, no. Elena's voice was steady, but steadiness wasn't the same as strength anymore. They fired you for saving someone. His eyes were red. He was 17 and brilliant, and he'd inherited her refusal to accept small losses, which meant he'd inherited her worst quality. They need to see who you are. They don't need to see anything. I chose to leave that behind. She said it like a prayer, like repetition could make it true. You didn't leave it behind. You're still her. You've always been her. He said it the way only children could say important things, with the certainty of someone who'd never learned that the world prefers you broken to powerful. Marcus texted Sacred Heart's main number before Elena could stop him. Before she could explain that some battles weren't worth fighting, that silence was a form of survival, that visibility was a weapon that only hurt the person holding it. I'm Elena Martinez's son. You fired my mother for saving a soldier's life. I have documentation of who she is. We're coming in at 1100 with her service records. He pressed send. Elena closed her eyes. The rain fell on her face, and she didn't wipe it away because the distinction between rain and tears had stopped mattering. At 10:50, they walked into Sacred Heart's administrative wing, water dripping from their coats onto linoleum that Elena had walked across 1,000 times in darkness. The conference room held Dr. Hargrove, 3 board members, and Mr. Paxton. Mrs. Chen, the hospital administrator, was there too, her hands folded on the polished table. Marcus opened the wooden case. The sound it made was like a gasp, that small hinge creak of something sealed finally opening. Metal spilled across the surface. Bronze catching the fluorescent light. Silver gleaming like accusations. Purple ribbon, the color of blood and memory. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, Marcus said, his voice cracking on her rank, his hand shaking as he pointed to each decoration. Navy Cross. Bronze Star with Valor. Second Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. 18 lives saved in Tikrit under enemy fire while her team, his voice broke, while her team bled out around her. The room went silent. The kind of silence that happens when the air pressure changes, when everyone in a room realizes simultaneously that they've been standing next to something they didn't see. Mrs. Chen picked up Elena's service file with trembling hands, reading commendations, reading dates, reading the medical certifications that exceeded any civilian requirement that existed, reading the documentation of a person who'd been trained to make life-or-death decisions and had chosen to spend 3 years taking vital signs and comforting the scared. I don't understand, Mrs. Chen whispered. That's when the door opened. The ranger entered in a wheelchair, for pole attached to the armrest, his sister pushing him from behind. Behind them stood a man in his 60s wearing a Navy SEAL trident pin on his collar, his eyes hard as obsidian, his bearing the kind that made ordinary men stand straighter just by proximity. Commander Wade Tesla. The room shifted. Hargrove's hand moved toward his phone. Elena saw it, the small unconscious gesture of a man reaching for his only remaining weapon. Wade saw it too. "Elena Martinez," Wade said. His voice was quiet, which meant everyone stopped breathing to hear it. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Martinez, United States Navy." He moved to the table and lifted the Navy Cross with the reverence of a man who'd seen what it took to earn it. Tikrit, 2004. Phi Base Delta. 11 hours under sustained mortar fire. 19 surgical procedures. 0 fatalities among her patients. When they ordered evacuation, she refused. Continued operations despite shrapnel wounds. He paused. 3rd Special Operations Battalion, Combat Medical Unit 7. Ryan wheeled himself forward. His voice was still rough from the breathing tube, the damage of near death still visible in how carefully he measured each breath. "I was 7 years old. Outside Tikrit. Humvee hit an IED. He looked at Elena. "She pulled me out before the fire reached the fuel tank. I wouldn't be here if she didn't know how to save someone." 2 board members were leaning back in their chairs. Paxton was closing his folder. Hargrove's hand was still moving, his fingers typing on his phone, accessing personnel systems, trying one more time to alter Elena's file retroactively, to change the narrative before it hardened into truth. Wade saw it. "Put that away, Doctor." Hargrove didn't put it away. The door opened. 2 FBI agents in dark suits entered, their badges catching light like small accusations. Agent Reyes stepped forward. "Dr. Marcus Hargrove, you're under arrest for unauthorized access to military personnel databases and attempted falsification of federal employment records." Hargrove's phone fell to the table. Clattered there like a confession. "You triggered 3 federal alerts in the last 67 minutes, Doctor. Every attempted access to classified military files is flagged. Every modification to a federal employee's record is logged. You created the evidence yourself." Handcuffs clicked. Wade picked up the 2nd Bronze Star from the table and held it where Hargrove could see it one last time. She earned every decoration in that box in a place where the cost of failure was somebody's child going home in a flag-draped box. He looked at Mrs. Chen. "This hospital just fired the most qualified trauma specialist in California. Congratulations on that decision." Elena stood motionless, her hands at her sides, her rain-soaked scrubs dripping onto the conference room carpet. Her son stood beside her, the wooden case still open on the table, the medals visible to everyone in the room now, not hidden anymore, not pretending to be smaller than they were. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, the person she'd tried to leave behind in the desert, was standing in the fluorescent light of a hospital conference room where she'd been fired for saving a life, and she wasn't breaking. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't looking away. She was just breathing, steady and measured, the way you breathe when you've already survived the worst the world can do. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause. Elena stood at the bus stop with the cardboard box, the one holding a cracked mug, a dying succulent, and the photograph of her 8-man medical team. Half of them dead. All of them forgotten. The weight of the box in her hands felt like the weight of 20 years. Like the weight of choosing invisibility over honor. Like the weight of a woman who'd held lives together only to have her own life disassembled by a man in a pressed shirt. Her 17-year-old son appeared breathless from running, cutting through the rain like a figure emerging from fog. Marcus didn't slow down. Didn't ask permission. He was holding a wooden case, burnished oak, the kind that didn't belong in their modest apartment. The kind that belonged in a locked closet, in the attic, in the dark where she'd buried it 20 years ago. "Mom, they need to see these." His voice cracked. Not from fear. From the clarity of understanding what his mother had carried alone all these years. Elena looked at the wooden case. The rain plastered her scrubs to her ribs. She didn't ask where he found it. She already knew. They drove back to Sacred Heart in silence. Marcus kept one hand on the case like it might dissolve if he wasn't watching it. The parking lot was different now, the same asphalt, but the weight of it had shifted. The rain followed them inside. Elena's shoes left wet footprints on the hospital floor, each step a sound, each sound a commitment. The administrative wing was on the 3rd floor. The hallway stretched long and polished, with the kind of silence that comes before everything changes. Dr. Hargrove sat at a conference table with 3 board members, his hand steepled in front of him like a man who'd already won. Mrs. Chen, the hospital administrator, was there. So was Security Chief Morrison. 2 people who'd fired Elena at 0800 hours without hearing her name spoken out loud. Marcus set the wooden case on the conference table. Metal spilled across the polished wood like coins from a broken bank. Bronze. Silver. Cloth and enamel and the weight of decisions made under fire. Purple heart. Purple heart again. A ribbon so dark it looked like blood against white cotton. Dr. Hargrove's face went the color of old bone. Marcus's voice filled the room. It was his mother's voice, measured, precise, the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what you're about to do. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. Each word a sentence. Each sentence a verdict. My mother. Retired Naval Medical Corps. Combat Tour, Tikrit, 2004 to 2005. Mrs. Chen picked up a file, Elena's personnel file, the one they'd used to fire her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. When she read, her voice was barely above a whisper, as though speaking louder might shatter something in the room. Tikrit. Iraq. 18 lives saved. Under enemy fire. Purple Heart. Bronze Star with Valor. Navy Cross. The administrator looked up. Her eyes were wet. You have a Navy Cross in your personnel file and we fired you. The doors to the conference room opened. A man in a wheelchair rolled in, the ranger, the 7-year-old from the burning Humvee, now 37 years old with captain's bars and the bearing of someone who'd learned how to survive because one woman had refused to leave him behind. Beside him walked a taller man in dress blues, a commander's shoulder boards catching the fluorescent light. His name was Wade Tesla. His voice when he spoke sounded like a tank idling in a garage, something massive held in check. This woman earned the Navy Cross. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. She pulled my friend here from a burning Humvee when she was 21 years old and didn't hesitate 1 second. The commander's jaw tightened. His unit called 3 hours ago. They want her at his bedside before discharge. They want to thank her. They want him to remember her face. The captain in the wheelchair said nothing. Didn't need to. The way he looked at Elena said everything. Dr. Hargrove stood. His chair fell backward, hit the floor with a sound like a closing door. He'd already spent 45 minutes that morning calling board members, calling his lawyer, preparing justifications. He'd fabricated documentation. He'd accessed military databases using credentials he'd stolen from a retired major he knew at the San Diego Athletic Club. He'd been meticulous. Strategic. Competent. He'd also been stupid enough to leave a digital footprint. The FBI agents walked in at 1,142 hours. 2 of them, moving with the fluid precision of people who'd done this exact thing 300 times before. One of them placed a printed email on the table, Hargrove's message to a contact at the Defense Information Systems Agency, requesting access codes to verify Elena's military record. The other email showed him asking a colleague to help him discredit the file and document her incompetence. Dr. James Hargrove, you're under arrest for attempting to forge federal employment records and unauthorized access to Department of Defense databases. That's a felony under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. You have the right to remain silent. He didn't remain silent. He asked about his lawyer. He asked about bail. He asked about his reputation. What he didn't ask about was Elena. What he didn't ask about was whether his career was over. He already knew. The handcuffs went on at 1,143 hours. The officers walked him through Sacred Heart's main corridor at noon, past the break room where Rebecca and Kim and Paolo had abandoned Elena 3 hours earlier. They stared as Dr. Hargrove passed in restraints, his expensive watch catching fluorescent light one last time. The watch had cost $12,000. His career had cost one woman's invisibility, and it was worth exactly nothing now. Elena followed them as far as the parking lot. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but water still pooled on the asphalt in dark mirrors. Wade Tesla waited at her car, the wooden case held loosely in his hands like a thing that finally belonged where it was. The Navy would take you back. His voice was the kind of offer that changes lives. Teaching position at Coronado. Combat medicine for the next generation. Full rank, full benefits. They've been monitoring your file since Tikrit. They never stopped watching for you. Elena looked at the case. 20 years. 20 years of scrubs and silence. 20 years of holding the invisible line between the nurse she pretended to be and the warrior she refused to let die. I don't know if I can, she said. You just performed battlefield medicine in a civilian hospital without any field equipment. You performed a pericardiocentesis on a cardiac tamponade patient while a licensed physician froze. You never stopped being a warrior, Elena. You just wore different boots. Marcus appeared from the stairwell holding something wrapped in plastic, something that had been sitting in the attic since 2005. He unwrapped it carefully. Combat boots. Desert tan. Worn at the heels. The leather was cracked, but the sole was still solid. The kind of boots that had walked through Tikrit and into operating theaters and through 20 years of pretending not to be invisible. You kept these, Marcus said. 20 years. Elena took them. The leather was warm in her hands. The captain in the wheelchair approached, his prosthetic leg moving with the kind of precision that comes from practice and will. He didn't try to hug her. Soldiers don't usually do that, not after combat, not in daylight, not where anyone can see. He extended his hand. My sister wants to know if you'll visit before I discharge, he said. His voice was his own again. No longer unconscious. No longer the child she'd pulled from fire. She wants to cook you dinner. Elena nodded. Couldn't speak. Her son put an arm around her shoulders and she didn't shake it off. For the first time in 20 years, she let someone hold her weight. 3 months later, Marcus filmed his mother in Navy dress whites at Coronado. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez stood in front of 18 young corpsmen, demonstrating the angle of approach for emergency pericardiocentesis. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that comes from having saved lives on 3 continents. Her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from knowing what it means to leave no one behind. The needle enters at the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. The syringe draws without resistance if you're in the pericardium. Fluid means tamponade. Fluid means you're buying them time. Don't hesitate. Speed is mercy. One corpsman raised his hand. Senior Chief, what if we freeze up? Elena set down the training dummy. She showed them the scars on her forearms, white lines from shrapnel, 20 years old, still visible. She lifted her sleeve to show them the Navy Cross tattoo, a faded replica that matched the real medal sitting in the wooden case on her office desk. You will freeze. Fear is human. But you'll move anyway. Someone's life is more valuable than your comfort. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Captain Ryan Voss stood at the back of the classroom in Ranger uniform, no longer a patient but a guest instructor. He saluted her. She returned it, crisp and measured, the kind of salute that carries 20 years of recognition. Marcus photographed that moment. 2 warriors. 2 generations. Both saved by hands that had refused to let go. At 1,400 hours that same afternoon, Elena and Marcus walked past a strip mall insurance office on Miramar Road. Through the plate glass window, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table, selling liability policies to customers who didn't know his name. His hair was grayer. His suit was off-the-rack polyester. A customer argued with him about premium rates while he clicked his pen and tried to look competent. He saw Elena on the sidewalk. Their eyes met for 3 seconds. She didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge him. Just kept walking, Marcus beside her, the combat boots hanging from her duty bag, worn at the heels, ready for the next mission. You ever think about what you'd say to him? Marcus asked. Elena adjusted the boots. Nothing. He spent his life climbing on other people's backs. Gravity found him. The sun was low and orange on the Pacific. Elena's classroom waited. Her students waited. Her life waited, finally, under her own name. The weight of invisibility had been replaced by something heavier and better, the weight of being seen, being known, being finally, fully home. That's when she understood. Leaving no one behind didn't just apply to the soldiers on the battlefield. It applied to herself too. Her son had refused to let her disappear into shame. He'd climbed that attic and brought her back out into the light. He'd forced the world to see what she'd always known, that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding everything together. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.